Robots Radio presents...
In 1982, director Steven Spielberg gave the world a magical adventure that captured the simplicity of childhood.
In 2019, we try our first Islay Scotch.
The film is E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial.
The whiskey is Laphroaig 10.
And we'll review them both. This is the
Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1982 film E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. Brad, we say every week that we are reviewing a classic film, and I think that there's different ways that a movie can qualify as a classic. It could be one of those movies that was really critically acclaimed. It could be a movie that won Oscars. It could be a movie that was a juggernaut at the box office, or it could be a movie that has had its reputation grow over time with the general public. And when it comes to E.T., I think this is one of those rare movies that kind of checks every single box.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this is a movie that was huge when it came out in 1982. And it's remained, a mainstay of 80s cinema. It's one of those things that I feel like so many people have seen and loved and continue to care about this movie.
Yeah, I really think you could make the case that this is the movie of the 1980s. I mean, it became the highest grossing film of all time. And on this side of it, as we look back on E.T., it's very obvious. We'd say, oh yeah, of course E.T. was a huge box office success. But when you sit down and watch the movie, especially this time through, what struck me about this film is that it's such a small, intimate story. It's not, Avengers Endgame. It's not even like a Titanic. It's a really intimate film.
Yeah, this movie really hones in on the story of these three children, and their single mom, and how they encounter this alien that really brings them together as a family.
Yeah, this really is the story of the family unit. And I think we'll get into, just how deeply it goes, because I think that the whole movie and the character of E.T. himself really is a metaphor for what's going on in the lives of this family. But just to start at the beginning here, Steven Spielberg basically came up with, he had what he calls like the germ of an idea for this movie while he was making Raiders of the Lost Ark. And first of all, let's give a shout out to our boy Steven Spielberg, because the man was just doing back-to-back-to-back hits at this time. Like, he's on the set of Raiders of the Lost Ark, making his Indiana Jones movie, and he starts thinking about E.T. And Spielberg had already made Close Encounters of the Third Kind at this point, so he had kind of already done his Alien movie. And Spielberg said, "I'd always wanted to tell the story of a disenfranchised and lonely boy in a relationship with his siblings. I also wanted to tell a story about a young child's reaction to his parents' divorce and how that impacts him for the rest of his life. It was also a childhood fantasy of mine to tell the story of a special best friend who rescues a young boy from the sadness of a divorce, so E.T. came about in stages for me." I think it's really interesting that the seed of this movie didn't come from, hey, let's make an alien movie. It came from, hey, how do we make a story about how a kid grapples with the concept of divorce? And what it became was this movie about an alien.
Yeah, I think in a lot of different ways, if you've never delved into the sci-fi genre, whether it's in literature or cinema, one of the beautiful things about sci-fi is that they use these alien races and worlds and, planetary travel to illustrate truths about humanity, about the human condition, and about how we relate to one another. And so in a lot of ways, most sci-fi that you will ever read or watch is more about humanity than it is about anything else.
Absolutely. It's a social commentary. And that's something that goes through the sci-fi genre from the very beginning. There's a really famous sci-fi movie from the 1950s called The Day the Earth Stood Still. And it was really an allegory for what was going on with nuclear armament at the time.
That's crazy that you bring that up, because when the ship was taking off at the very end of the movie, I literally thought to myself, I was like, oh, this is a little bit of Day this, Earth Stood Still style. I can see that here.
Yeah, there's definitely the influence of that movie is all over the place here. And I think in turn, E.T. as a sci-fi movie or as a sort of fantastical elements to it has influenced so many other films dealing with childhood trauma. You know, even over the last 10 or so years, you had movies like Where the Wild Things Are, and there was a really great movie that came out a couple years ago called A Monster Calls, which was all about this kid basically dealing with his mom having like a terminal illness. And in both of those movies, you get the sort of E.T. premise, which is there's this sort of fictional character that comes in and helps these kids through their traumas. And I think it's a fantastic framing device. And it, you know, I'm no counselor, but I have to imagine that a movie like E.T. is just a great gateway into talking to kids about these issues and helping them process.
Yeah, and we're already getting really deep into our analysis here, Bob. We should probably revert back to our first question, which is, hey, Brad, have you ever seen this movie? And then follow it up with Brad Explains.
So why don't we do that? Brad, I think you gave our listeners a little bit of a hint at the end of the last episode, but had you ever seen the movie E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial?
Dude, I'd never even heard of the movie.
Shut up. Shut up.
Yeah, no, I had never seen the movie before. It's one of those things where, like, I never saw it as a child. It just, I don't know if it wasn't in our house or I don't know. I just never saw it as a kid. And then as an adult, I don't know. I didn't have any friends that watched it, never had a chance to go back to it. But it was always on the edge of my conscience as like, oh, this is a movie that I should probably see at some point because I know how big of a cultural touchstone it is.
So Brad had never seen this movie. I'm really shocked that you hadn't seen this movie, man, because this is one of those ones that I feel like as Americans of a certain age, I can't imagine my childhood apart from the movie E.T. It's just, I was watching it with my wife last night, and I said it was kind of like The Wizard of Oz for a generation. Like anyone born after 1970, they were at an age when E.T. was the movie of their childhood.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to ask my parents what they thought about E.T. because they were born in the late 50s and early 60s, so they were, adults by the time it came out. I'd be really curious to hear what they have to think about, something like this.
Well, I mean, hey, we're both adults, and it's the first time you've seen the movie, so maybe it's time for us to ask the question, what did you think of the movie, by way of Brad explaining the plot to us of E.T.
So E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial, is a movie about a young boy who is a little bit younger than his older brother and his friends and is trying to fit in. And their family unit has been torn apart by divorce, which you kind of start to see hints of that pretty early in the movie. And he finds this alien. And this alien had been on the earth healing plants.
Yeah, I think they were like foraging, like they were taking different forms of life back onto their ship. I couldn't quite tell.
Okay, yeah. So, these aliens come down in a very classic alien ship type of thing. And they forage or they heal stuff or they do something. But E.T. gets left behind, the main alien. So Elliot, the main character, finds him and they become best friends and they teach each other lessons. And Elliot introduces E.T. to his older brother Mike and his younger sister Gertie, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The story is about how the government eventually finds them, and E.T. gets drunk on beer, and Elliot kisses a girl.
I like how E.T. gets drunk on beer is like a major plot point in this telling.
Oh, that was huge, man. I mean, this is the 1980s, and they're showing like Elliot getting drunk because E.T. was getting drunk with their psychic connection.
Yeah, listen,
I mean, it was powerful stuff.
If you can't get a 10-year-old drunk, it's not the 1980s.
Yeah, right? Seeing as all the movie producers were doing coke at the time, they probably didn't even know what the story writers were saying. Like, oh, what are you pitching us? 10-year-old getting drunk in class? Sounds good.
Green light it now. All right, so to wrap up, Brad explains. After kids get drunk, then what happens?
So the government eventually finds E.T., and they put him into this, medical examination tent, and it looks like they're tenting his house for roaches, and E.T. dies, but then he's resurrected like Jesus, and they run away from the cops and send him back to his home planet.
Yeah, and that's every plot point of the movie E.T. Nice job, sir.
But especially Elliot gets drunk.
Kids getting drunk. Yeah, that's absolutely crucial that we say that. So I want to start at the very, very beginning of the film. First thing you see is the title card for E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. And this movie had such huge promotional tie-ins that I'm sure everyone knew going into the movie already what E.T. looked like because his face was just everywhere. But what I love about what Spielberg does is he starts the movie off like a horror movie. The music that John Williams lays down in the background is this really eerie, like dissonant, keeps you off guard kind of music. You don't have any indication of what's going on. It's just black screen with text on it. And then the first, 10, 12, 13 minutes of the movie are basically silent. And a lot of it is seen from the perspective of this tiny alien. And you have no idea, like, is this thing a threat? Is this thing a protagonist? And Spielberg was leaning into his reputation because he had made, for a time, the highest grossing movie of all time, Jaws, which is a straight up horror movie. And we forget sometimes that Spielberg's roots are in the genre of horror. And I think it was brilliant because until Elliot not only finds E.T., but brings him into the house, you're still a little bit convinced as a viewer that things might go really, really wrong here.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. Those opening scenes kind of felt like a C-rate horror movie to me.
Oh, interesting.
They didn't flow very well. I will say, before I say anything else about this movie, I truly believe my favorite part of this movie was John Williams' music.
Oh gosh, and we'll get to that because we can't not talk about John Williams' score.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, the opening 10 minutes of the movie, and this movie needs a remake, man. Like the animatronics of the time do not come across well in this movie.
Bro, don't even start right now. Don't even start with me right now. We're not nitpicking yet, Brad.
Okay, I'm just saying.
You
the
need to
opening
save
scene,
it, bro.
I really struggled with the animatronics, and it just kind of felt like a C-rate, horror thriller film where they're like following this random thing around, and there's close-ups of truck headlights pouring through the woods, and we don't know what's happening, and dun dun dun, what's going to happen next? I just struggle with the opening a little bit. That's all.
So here's my thing with the opening is that I remember as a kid, like the first 20 minutes of the movie for me were like unbearably boring. As an adult, I really appreciate what Spielberg is doing there because it's essentially like a silent film. I mean, so much of this movie happens without dialogue, and as a viewer, you're asked to kind of piece things together. And I don't think Spielberg does it in a way that confuses the viewer either. Like, you find out what you need to know about these aliens, about their culture, about what they're doing on their spaceship. When all of their little heart lights turn on, you understand that it's kind of like this homing beacon that they have inside of them. And you get all of that without a narrator having to tell you anything, without the aliens having to talk to each other and us get like weird alien subtitles. And I actually think it's really brilliant. And your point about like seeing the truck headlights and stuff, that's an intentional decision by Spielberg that you'll notice throughout the movie is that almost the entire movie is filmed from the vantage point of a child. Or from E.T., like someone small. Like, you see all of the adults from the waist down. And Spielberg actually said that he wanted it to be that way because he wanted to make sure that he kept Elliot in a position of power throughout the movie. And that the more he showed adults kind of towering over him or looking down on him, then you would lose Elliot, the main character, as a person who actually was the key to the movie. And so I think to establish that from the very beginning of the kid's eye view is a really, really cool touch.
Yeah, and you see that especially in the frog scene where he's drunk and they're doing frogs. Okay, first off, what was going on in the 1980s that they were murdering frogs in front of children by putting chloroform?
Yeah, seriously. We got our frogs like dead, straight dead. And like basically they were thawing. They were deep frozen.
And like also this teacher walking around with a giant jar full of chloroform.
Chloroform. Yeah. We live in a post Walter White era where biology and chemistry teachers do not have access to the meth making materials they once did.
But putting all of that aside, I do agree with you that one of the movie's strength is its ability to hone in on Elliot and Mike and Gertie's point of view throughout, and through its use of cinematography, especially.
Now, I want to point out, Brad, just for you and for our friendship, that I was really hoping that you would love this movie, and I was banking on the early scene where all of the teenagers are playing Dungeons and Dragons. Did you pick up on that scene at all?
Oh, for sure, man. Yeah, like you said, the opening 10 minutes or so were kind of boring. Like I said, I struggle with them a little bit, and then you get into the kids playing D&D, and I was sucked right in. That dragged me in really quickly.
Well, why don't we talk about the kids for a minute? Because this really is their movie. You know, there's a few adults in the movie that have major parts, and we'll get to them. But the three main actors of the film are Henry Thomas as Elliot, Drew Barrymore as Gertie, and Robert McNaughton as, is it Michael? Is his name Michael?
Yeah, Michael. They call him Mike and Michael at times.
Okay, all right. So what did you think of the three main, basically child actors?
Honestly, I loved Elliot. I think Elliot might have turned in the best performance of the three, but I liked Mike the most for some reason. There was something about his character that he's that older brother that everybody wants. That, like, yeah, he makes fun of you and kind of pushes you around a little bit. But when push comes to shove, he has Elliot's back.
Yeah.
He'll do absolutely anything for Elliot and for Gertie. And there's something about his loyalty that just sucked me into his character. I really loved Michael a lot.
Yeah, I really appreciated him this time around too, especially as an actor, because I don't know what age he was supposed to be playing, but he's probably playing a little younger than he was in reality. And I think he really captures that age, you know, in boyhood, where he's old enough to be playing on the football team, but he's still young enough to be able to believe in the power of this magical creature. He's right in between that stage of, you know, childhood and adulthood, of like innocence and basically becoming old and jaded. And I thought he played that dynamic really, really well.
For sure. He really captures that essence of being a middle schooler, where you're really trying hard to be an adult, but you still get sucked into childhood so easily, and he plays that extremely well.
All right, let's talk about Drew Barrymore for a minute. You know, she was like, I think 6 years old when she made this movie. And, you know, obviously this movie kind of catapulted her to stardom, and she immediately started making terrible life choices because of the access to stuff she had from fame. But it's really cool to look back on this performance and where it brought us with Drew Barrymore, even to today. I thought that she was adorable. I mean, and I think her character is only required to be adorable, but she really nailed it.
Yeah, for being a child actress at the time, I think that there are certain lines that she delivers and you're like, oh, that's a kid actress. But then there's other lines that she delivers that are just absolutely on point, and you're like, oh wow, I can see why she becomes a future star.
Yeah, I mean, I have one line written down that I don't even know if I want to touch on it right yet, because it's going to go so far into our analysis, but I will say that the emotion that she shows in the movie, and I think that all of the kids show in the movie, it's so genuine, and it's such a testament to the way that Spielberg directed these kids. You know, I've watched some of the behind the scenes clips, and he doesn't talk down to them. He just kind of explains to them, here's what you're going to do in the course of the movie. But then he'll also tell them, you know, this is where we're at in the story. And your friend E.T. is going to go away now. And as kids, these kids came to grow and love even this puppet, E.T. And you watch their genuine reactions happening on screen. And Spielberg is smart enough sometimes to just let the cameras roll and capture these moments. And I think they translate so well to the screen, and they really help drive home the emotional point he's trying to make.
Yeah, I'm thinking especially of the scene when E.T. is dying and they have him in that weird little hospital room that they've, you know, set up in his house.
Yep.
And Elliot is just screaming and, you know, you're killing him. And he just conveys this passion where you're like, man, how did Spielberg draw that out of this small child?
Listen, and this is why I kind of saved Henry Thomas for last in my comments here, because I have always contended that I think Haley Joel Osment may have been the best child performance of all time. But revisiting E.T., Henry Thomas is freaking phenomenal. Like, he plays every scene perfectly.
E.T. phone home. Phone home.
Does this mean they're coming?
Yes. E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home. Phone home.
Quiet.
Phone.
You
E.T.
shut
phone
up.
home. Phone home. E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home. E.T. phone home.
Even the scenes where he's supposed to be misleading the adults or like play acting, you know, the scene after E.T. is resurrected basically, and he has to pretend like he's crying to cover up the glowing heart. He just nails every single scene. And it's crazy that you can hinge a movie like this on a kid who's probably like 10 or 11 years old, and you're asking him to convincingly play dying and to convincingly play opposite of an animatronic puppet. And he brings the goods, man. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and then right after he pretends to cry over the death to cover up the heart, his brother, screams in excitement and jumps, and he accidentally knocks into the ceiling. And, it's just that perfect capturing of childhood enthusiasm at getting what their heart desires.
It's such a great touch. And I think there's a few elements in this movie. I kind of took myself out of the movie just for a minute to appreciate what I was watching, because it's the scene where E.T. is in that bed and he's dying and they're trying to resuscitate him. And I took myself out of the movie for a second because I was so into it that I just took a step back and said, I am literally watching a rubber puppet with an oxygen tube in its nose, and I have tears in my eyes because I think this puppet is dying. Because everyone in that scene is so convincingly playing what's happening on screen that I was just sucked in. And I think it is such a testament to what Spielberg is able to do with emotional moments. I didn't feel like it was manipulative. I didn't feel like it was cloying, or that he was painting by numbers to get the audience to cry. That's a really earned moment in that movie.
Yeah, I think Spielberg, as a director, I think one of his greatest qualities is that he's a very honest director. He doesn't try to force emotion on you. He doesn't try to, suck it out of you with a vacuum. He legitimately just gives you situations and gives you people's reactions to them, because he's a very personal, upfront director, that you don't have any choice but to feel the honest, raw emotions of the characters on the screen.
Like I said, there's a couple things that kind of help him out in that regard, and I think one of them is the cinematography. I didn't remember this movie being as beautiful as it is, because a lot of it has that sort of 1980s fog filter effect going on, but when you realize the way that they're lighting this movie is really purposeful, a lot of people are backlit. There's tons of silhouettes in this movie. And then there's other scenes where you can tell they're kind of trying to disguise the E.T. doll a little bit. And so they're playing with shadows, they're playing with light. But I was really struck by some of the shots in this movie. Those opening shots of E.T. wandering through the redwood forest were just freaking beautiful. And it's something that I didn't remember. And I think it's because, I first watched E.T. on a VHS tape that was panned and scanned. And, they cropped the aspect ratio down, and I was watching it on an old TV, and you don't quite get the beauty of the movie. When I was watching it on disc last night, it really came through to me in a way that it hadn't before.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the most important aspects of having good cinematography is pairing it with a beautiful soundtrack that underlies that cinematography to enhance what's being seen. And we can't ignore how phenomenal John Williams is in this movie.
Honestly, Brad, I think that there are other scores, like John Williams' score for Star Wars, where he's developing different themes for different characters. It's much more operatic. There's much more going on from a classical music standpoint. But top to bottom, this might be my favorite John Williams score. The music is just so beautiful and so moving, and it so perfectly captures the feeling of flying, the feeling of childhood, that I don't know if he's ever topped it.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Like you said, I think in Star Wars, he goes so deep into character-driven music, and I don't think he's ever done a better job with that than in Star Wars. But in this movie, he really does capture that soaring feeling of, what it would be like to be a child who has met an alien who has become your best friend and who you're now sailing through the sky with. I mean, it's really amazing, but even in the quiet moments, in the tender moments of the movie, he just kind of softly underplays what's happening with this music that is at once uplifting and sad. It's dissonant, but it's progressive. There's something about it that's just, it hits the right notes every single scene.
And I love that Williams leans into the sort of creepy aspect at the beginning of the movie too, because it really does help make an atmosphere. At least it did for me. It made an atmosphere of unease when Elliot decides to camp out outside his house and E.T. comes walking out of the shed. And of course, he's backlit and it's a silhouette and you don't know what you're quite looking at. And he's making these strange sounds. Elliot's so terrified that he can't call out for his mom. That's a genuinely creepy scene. And Williams' music just enhances it that much more.
For sure. We could probably talk about John Williams for the rest of the episode. But in order to do that, we should probably turn on over to our Laphroaig and give it a try.
Let's do it, Brad. All right, so today we are checking out Laphroaig 10-year. Now, Laphroaig, if you couldn't tell by the heavily Gaelic-sounding word, is a Scotch whiskey. We are in the 4th week of our September of Scotch.
The September of Scotch.
And Brad, this is kind of a milestone for us because when it comes to Scotch, there's essentially, if we're going to be, reductive about it, there's 2 kinds of Scotches. There's peaty Scotches and there's non-peaty Scotches. And we have never drank an actually peated Scotch before. Now, peat is a thing it sounds gross, and I think it kind of is gross, if I can tip my hand a little bit here. Peat is essentially a term that they give to, decaying matter. Basically, it's like what you would find in a bog or a marsh or a swamp. And the peat affects the flavor of the water that's being used to make a peated Scotch. And it's also used sometimes in the sort of heating, baking process to malt the barley that they're using. So this flavor is getting into the Scotch at every level. And basically what it smells and what it tastes like is just smoke. And it's different from a barrel char. And I always describe it to people as imagine somebody put out their cigar in your glass of whiskey. And that's peat.
Yeah, there's more to it than that, though. I think I can smell a lot of that earthiness, a lot of that mossy smell.
Let's just share a little bit about Laphroaig. So this is a 10-year aged whiskey. Laphroaig is what's called an Islay whiskey. It's spelled Islay, but it's not Islay, it's not Islay, it's Islay. And that is a region of Scotland where these heavily peated Scotches are really from. There's a few areas where they make peated Scotches, but if you have an Islay Scotch, chances are it's going to have this really heavy, smoky, peaty flavor to it. So, Brad, you have already been kind of previewing it. What are you picking up on the nose of this Laphroaig 10-year?
Honestly, your first blast is peat. It's that mossy, earthy, punch you in the nose kind of smell. But underneath it, you can smell Scotch. So we've tried about 4 or 5 Scotches now throughout the entire, history of the podcast. And all of them have been a little bit sweeter versions of what we're about to drink. And you can still smell that underneath the peat in this Scotch.
Yeah. So I'm gonna give myself away a little bit here. I have attempted to drink peated Scotches on many occasions because I think if you're a true Scotch person, then chances are you like these peaty single malt Scotches. And I don't like peat. I don't. And it really is a preference thing. And so I've tried this Laphroaig before and not enjoyed it. And so this time around, what I've done is I have poured this Laphroaig and I've just let it sit for a couple minutes. Because Brad's right. The initial blast that you get on the nose really, really is nothing but smoke. But after about 4 or 5 minutes of letting it mellow, I'm kind of picking up these really interesting notes. And maybe you can help me out here, Brad, but it's kind of fruity, but it's a really dark, almost like a dark grape, like what I would expect a wine grape to smell like, or raisins or something like that. Are you picking up any fruit on this?
Yeah, I 100% am. I almost feel like it almost has a grapefruit type of
interesting.
smell.
More of a citrus to you.
Yeah, it smells a little bit more citrusy, although I totally get what you're saying. I think that there's a lot of depth to this Scotch, that you do kind of have those notes of darkness, the wine type smell, mixed in with a little bit of bright citrusy.
Yeah, for me it's either like a raisin or like a black cherry. It's something much, much darker than a citrus. So, Brad, what would you give this on the nose?
I'm going to give this an 8 on the nose. It's extremely complex, very interesting, and it makes me want to try it.
I'm going to give it a 6.5 on the nose. You guys, if you listen to the podcast, I like my sweet whiskeys. This doesn't smell like it's going to have a lot of sweetness to it. But underneath those layers of peat, if you can get past that, it really is rewarding. Like Brad said, it's pretty complex. So I'm going to give it a 6.5. Why don't we give it a taste?
Woo, breathe in that smoke, baby. Let's go.
All right, so here's what I'll say about it. On the very, very tip of my tongue, it did seem like it was going to be really sweet. And it was like immediately spicy. Like not a burn, but just spice. And then as I swallowed it, there's like no flavor to it. It's just, there's no sweetness to it. And it almost reminds me of like if you've ever had like mineral water, like those waters that come in the glass bottles. It has this sort of like mineral taste to it as you swallow it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this scotch because I get the sweetness on the front, and then you just get lots and lots of smoke on the back of your tongue.
Yeah.
And I it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not perfect.
No, it's very like black and white. You know what I mean? Like I feel like there's nothing in the middle of my palate as it goes from the front of my mouth to the back of my mouth. It's like sweet and spicy, and then you swallow it and it has like smoke and this like earthy mineral taste to it. And that's pretty much it.
I feel like your note of mineral is right. It almost tastes a little bit like sea salt. Like it has this saltiness to it.
And I guess that's a characteristic of Islay scotches. And it may just be where they're located in Scotland, but people really do pick up on that sort of saltwater flavor as well.
Yeah.
So, Brad, what would you give this on the taste?
On the taste, I'm going to give it a 6.5. It doesn't quite hold up to the nose like I hoped it would, but it's still a good, solid taste.
I'm going to give it a 5.5. It's actually much more drinkable than I remember it being, especially if you let it kind of sit for a couple minutes and get that initial smoke out of the way. What I really like about it is that, and we'll get to this in finish too, after I swallow it, it really makes me like salivate. Like it doesn't dry my mouth out. And so because of that, it makes me want to drink more, which is something I can't say for a lot of peated scotches. So I'm going to give it a 5.5.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And as far as the finish goes, there's even less flavor on the finish, which is disappointing. But this is the classic, I just took a drag on a cigar smoke that I'm looking for in a scotch.
Yeah, in terms of taste, there's like no flavor left in your mouth. Like I said, it has that sort of mineral thing going on, and that makes me sort of salivate. It kind of burns going down a little bit, and you get smoke. And so that's really the only finish you're left with. I'm actually shocked at how quickly the finish dissipates. It's gone really, really fast.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm going to give it a 6 on the finish. It's solid, but it's just okay.
All right, and that brings us to overall balance. So we're talking about nose, taste, and finish. Brad, how do you think this one stacked up?
Yeah, I think that it kind of lied on the nose a little bit. It gave me more there than I actually got on my palate. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a 6 on balance as well.
A 6 on balance. Yeah, I think I'm going to give it a 7 on the balance. I think overall it's a pretty well-balanced scotch. It doesn't lie about how much peat it's going to have on it, that's for sure. I do think you're right. The nose hinted at something that didn't end up being there on the taste or the finish. So I'm going to give it a 7.
Yeah, and as far as total value goes, we're looking at $50 for a bottle of this, 10-year aged scotch in the state of Ohio. And I guess not having drank many peated scotches, I can't necessarily compare it to others, but I'm going to go ahead and give it a 6 on value. I don't know if I would want to spend $50 on a fifth of this scotch, on a regular basis.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with you, Brad. And I think this would be a good place to acknowledge that this bottle of Laphroaig was actually donated to us by one of our listeners, Evan Steinberger. She follows us on Instagram at Evan Renee. And she basically wrote and said, hey, I tried this whiskey. I listen to the podcast every week. It's one of the most interesting whiskeys I've ever had. Can we send some to you? So absolutely. And first of all, to Film and Whiskey Nation, anything you want us to try, Brad and I are pretty much game for being honest here.
Absolutely happy to try anything you want to send our way.
But I want to shout out, Evan, thank you so much for this bottle of Laphroaig. But when it comes to the value, I think I agree with you, Brad. $50 is not an exorbitant amount of money to pay for a scotch, but this is Laphroaig's entry level. It only goes up in age statements and finishes and things like that from here. So at $50 for your buy-in, I'm not quite sure if this has enough character to it to really merit that. And again, I don't really like peated scotches, but if I did, I still don't think this one has enough going on in it to be the one that I'd want to have on my shelf. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's just not quite enough complexity here for me. You know, it's very simple from taste to finish. There's more going on the nose, but yeah, I just wish there was a little more going on, and I probably would give this a higher score on value.
So we both came out to a 6 on value. Brad, what does that bring you out to for your final score?
My final score is a 32.5.
My final score is a 30.5, so that brings us right out in the middle there to a 31.5 or a 63 out of 100. You know, I do think this is a pretty good whiskey for being a variety that I just don't like, but I can't recommend spending $50 a bottle on it.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say I don't recommend this. Let's be really honest, Bob. We would recommend pretty much anything if somebody's going to drink whiskey. Go drink whiskey. It's really good.
Absolutely. I mean, I would recommend trying it. I'd recommend drinking it. I don't know if I would recommend it to you if you were asking me, what can I buy for $50?
Yeah, if that's the category we're working under, yes, I would agree with you. I would not recommend this be the $50 bottle of whiskey you go purchase. But in the end, if you're looking for a peated scotch and you're trying to get introduced into the world of peated scotch, I would honestly highly recommend this scotch. You know, as somebody who has tried 5 or 6 non-peated scotches now, this one has enough reminiscent of those scotches that I enjoy the peat along with those other flavors that come along with it. So I guess in a certain way, I recommend and I don't recommend. It's good.
I think it's a good gateway scotch, you know, and that's pretty much what we've been trying all through our September of Scotch. So if you're looking to get into peat, this is probably a good place to start. Brad, I guess the real question is, would Elliot like to get drunk off of this?
Ooh, that is a very good question. And based on the fact that he was drinking Coors Light, I'm going to say no.
Yeah, probably not. What do you say we get back into talking about E.T.?
Let's do it.
All right, so that was Laphroaig 10 Year. I think we're going to continue sipping on it as we finish out the episode today. Brad, I have told you to hold your tongue long enough. I think that I'm finally ready to hear your nitpicks about E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, but just be aware that if you nitpick too hard, you're going to hear it from me.
So there's a lot of problems with this movie.
What? A lot?
Oh, yeah, dude.
What? Oh, gosh. All right, this is coming from the guy. I'm already going to start. This is coming from the guy who thinks Star Wars is like a nearly perfect movie.
Yeah, Star Wars is a phenomenal movie. It blows E.T. out of the water.
Oh, gosh. All right, let's hear your stupid nitpicks, Brad.
Okay, and honestly, my nitpicks with the movie actually come back to what we talked about earlier as a strength of the film, being the fact that it is filmed largely from a child's perspective. And while I 100% agree that by doing it that way, Spielberg gives a strength to Elliot and Mike and Gertie's character that you wouldn't have had otherwise, I think that there's so many drawbacks to that style of filmmaking that it makes this movie so daggone confusing. Like, I never know what's going on. I never know why people are doing things. Like, the government coming in and just, you know, tenting the house like they have cockroaches out of nowhere. It's just so confusing. And the second half of the movie especially just devolves into this madness. And it doesn't work for me because you never get an adult's perspective. I just think that the movie falls apart in a lot of ways in the second half.
That's so fascinating to me because honestly, if there was a part of the movie that I think could use some work, it would be the first half of the movie. And I think that once we get to like the Halloween sequence and everything that follows it, you know, that iconic shot of Elliot going across the moon, everything after that point is such a tightly constructed movie. Like, there's no fat on that thing in the second half. And so I'm really shocked that the second half is what didn't do it for you.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is, as you were starting to talk about it, I was about to say, the second half of the movie is super tight. Like, you move from scene to scene to scene without almost any transition, any explanation, any, you know, talking about what's going on. And that's the problem. Like, I'm sorry, but just showing a few pickup trucks at the start of the movie scaring E.T. does not explain the fact that the government has these advanced scientists and FBI agents and, you know, X-Files people checking in on Elliot and listening to him in a van. I just struggled. I needed more foundation to be grounded with to understand why the whole second half of the movie happens. I think that the first half of the movie, you have a really beautiful story about a young boy trying to deal with divorce and a broken family and finding wholeness in, a imaginary friend that actually turns out to be a real alien. And then the second half of the movie just falls apart because it turns into an almost action film that has its, sweet moments when Elliot's crying for E.T. and so on and so forth. But overall, I just feel like the movie falls apart in the second half.
And I think that's really interesting, Brad, because I can see how the movie drags in parts and the second half it doesn't drag so much, but I don't see the themes of the movie differing from the first half to the second half. And I think that's what we're going to get into here in our analysis. Do you have any other nitpicks that you want to get out of the way before we go there?
Well, the main thing is that the theme of the opening half of the movie is that, Elliot is trying to rebuild trust with humanity. He's become broken. And then the second half of the movie reinforces the fact that you can't trust adults and you can only trust yourself or other children and that adults are the enemy. And I just think that brings a discord to the themes of the movie that I didn't enjoy at all.
Yeah, I do think that because I see this movie so much as a metaphor, I think that you're right, Brad. I think you can read it that way, that adults are the enemy. And I'm pretty sure Spielberg has at some point even said, like, the theme of the movie is that adults are the enemy to these kids. But for me, the adults in the movie are really a metaphor for how kids can be let down by something like a divorce. And, we talked about this with Catch Me If You Can. Steven Spielberg grew up really kind of estranged from his father. Now, his dad was around, his dad was in the picture, but it's really clear that they have a very strained relationship. And so many of Spielberg's movies grapple with fatherlessness or guys not getting along with their fathers, having estranged relationships. And I think the adults in this movie really are a metaphor for how adults can mess kids up.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see the mom as a protagonist in a lot of ways throughout the movie. She's one of the only adults that you see her face consistently, shot to shot. And you see her trying to defend and love Elliot through a lot of it. But so she would be the one adult that really is on his side per se. But I don't know if I like the rest of that theme. And it really goes along with the 1980s, stick it to the man. The adults are they're out to get us. Who are you to tell us what to do? And I don't like that theme, that trope as a whole.
Yeah, I see this particular movie, I see less as kids need to rise up and like parents are dumb and let's overthrow them, as much as it is like, I think everyone in this movie is portrayed as trying their best. When we finally see the face of the guy who has been pursuing E.T., played by Peter Coyote, we think that he is a villain, and Spielberg lets us see that, no, he's actually a human being. But the way that children's minds can make the creepy old man down the street into a villain, like how it was with To Kill a Mockingbird and the Boo Radley house, I kind of saw it more like that. And the fact that the adults can come in and bring upheaval into Elliot's life, for me, that's really a metaphor of what divorce does to a kid's psyche. And so, I mean, if I could just talk about that for a minute, I think the way to read this movie, and I think it answers all of your questions, Brad, is to read this movie as how divorce introduces a new element into the lives of everyone that it affects. E.T., like the creature, the alien E.T., is a direct metaphor for the father-son relationship that Spielberg is trying to tell us. Because I think in some scenes, E.T. is like a stand-in for Elliot. Like, Elliot sees himself in E.T., and in other scenes, everyone is treating E.T. the way that they are treating, like, their absentee dad. E.T. like really represents Elliot's need for a parental figure. And E.T.'s going away at the end of the movie, and Elliot learning to cope with loss in that way is a sign of Elliot's growth. Like, he doesn't understand why his dad left. He doesn't even necessarily understand why E.T. has to go home. He wants him to stay. but it's a story of Elliot's growth and learning to deal with loss. And I think it's a really, really beautiful picture of that. You know, we never do find out what happened to the dad other than that he's not around and that he went to Mexico.
With Sally.
And we see Elliot grappling with that throughout the movie. You know, the scene where they go into the woods to try to send the signal to E.T.'s spaceship, he spends that whole scene trying to convince him. He's saying, I want you to stay. You could be happy here. And like, I'm watching that scene and I had tears in my eyes because you can see Elliot saying that to his dad as he walks out the door to go move away with Sally. And I think everyone in this movie, all of the characters in that family, are reacting to E.T. the way that you would react to this new presence in your life that comes in the form of a divorce.
Yeah, I think that definitely draws at a lot of the important themes in the movie, and I think it is a way to kind of tie everything up. I just still struggle with a lot of the ways Spielberg chooses to show us the adult characters in this movie. Like when you brought up Peter Coyote earlier, even when Spielberg tries to humanize him, I just can't figure out who the heck is this guy? Like, why is he here? Why is he even in the movie? I couldn't figure out anything to do with him, and it just totally threw me off of what Spielberg was trying to do, which I agree. He was trying to establish this metaphor of growth for Elliot as a young child dealing with the fallout of a messy divorce.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you to some extent, but I think that I still agree with the way that they handled it, especially with the Peter Coyote character, in a couple ways. You know, when you see those guys showing up at the house in like full spacemen outfits and, you know, like you said, tenting their house essentially, I really do think that you can keep that allegory or that metaphor going there. And to me, it was like, this is how divorce can like invade a household. It's this surreal experience where Elliot's own house has been turned into something that he doesn't recognize anymore. And I thought that the decision to not give these guys a backstory was really smart, because at the end of the day, the story is not about how things got messed up. The story is about how things get made better. And what I love about the character of E.T. is, you know, they give him these healing powers. They don't give him the healing powers for no reason. Like, it's obviously there because what he's healing is Elliot's home situation. He's healing Elliot's life. And that shot that you keep getting of those flowers reblooming, it's this sign that something good can come out of a terrible, terrible situation. And so when you get to the end of the movie, I don't care who Peter Coyote's character is. I know enough about him to know that he's not a threat to Elliot, but Elliot's not paying attention to him because that's not the main story. And I think that all culminates in that last line that E.T. says to Elliot. And that's, you know, that's where the waterworks start for me. When he lights up his finger and he looks at Elliot and he says, "I'll be right here."
I'll be right here.
Because to me, like, those are the words that Elliot needed to hear from his dad that's not there anymore. And that really completes the whole picture for me. That's the moment that Elliot gets closure. That's the moment where you finally understand where the story has been going this whole time. It's this kid learning to deal with the divorce of his parents, learning to find a relationship and intimacy again, and learning how to cope with loss and move on. And I think, honestly, it is such a beautiful picture.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the themes of the movie in that way, you can see the beauty of the movie, but I didn't get that when I was actually watching the film. And that's my big struggle with this movie, is that I feel like it's too convoluted. There's too many moving parts in the second half, you know, and not in the sense that it's not tightly cut, because it is. There's no fat on it, like you said earlier. But there's just too much going on. You know, why are the other three kids or two, you know, young boys suddenly riding their bicycles with them? And why are they getting 4 to 5 second, you know, face shots on camera at the end of the movie when you should be just paying emotional attention to Elliot and Mike and Gertie? There's just stuff happening in this movie that I go, man, Spielberg nails it in certain parts and just completely whiffs on other parts. And I really struggle with it.
I'm seriously shocked that you're struggling so much with it. But I guess to some extent, I probably shouldn't be shocked. This movie was nominated for 9 Oscars. It won 4. It was so highly regarded in the moment. But today, when you go on to IMDb, this movie only has a 7.8. And I was kind of floored that this movie is nowhere in the top 250. And I mean, Brad, I don't know what your score is going to be yet, but I think it's probably fair to say that you at least expected this movie to be in the top 250 on IMDb.
Yeah, I actually went and looked it up afterwards to see what it was, and I wasn't surprised to see it at a 7.8. I don't think, and I said this earlier in the movie, and you told me to go kick rocks, but the animatronics have not aged well. E.T. looks like poop, bro.
E.T. looks like poop. That's the quote from this episode, folks.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, even on Rotten Tomatoes, this has a 98% score from the critics, but a 72% score from the audience.
What? 72?
Yeah. And that's
crazy.
That's from 32 million user ratings.
I am watching a different movie, I guess. And Brad, I want to hear what your final score is, and I want to hear if you would recommend.
Bob, I am going to give E.T. a 6 out of 10.
Brad, a 6?
Bob, it's not that great of a movie.
I feel hurt inside. I feel like if my heart could light up like E.T., it would only like dimly light up right now because I am so hurt emotionally by the fact that you do not like this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I like the movie well enough. It's okay, but it's just okay.
Wow.
I feel like you're probably sitting there right now, white and ashen like E.T. as he's dying.
Yeah, I'm basically laying in a ravine with a raccoon around my ankles.
Bob, what score would you give this movie?
Brad, this is a rare movie for me in that, you know, I do think I understand some of your nitpicks. I think that the scene of Elliot getting drunk definitely doesn't play well in 2019. But even then, I can see how that scene feeds the central metaphor because the mom thinks Elliot drank a bunch of beers as a result of not being able to cope with divorce. This movie, when you look at it through the lens of trauma and healing, I think is such a beautiful picture. John Williams' score, Steven Spielberg's direction. It's a nearly perfect movie, in my opinion. And I'm giving this movie a 10 out of 10.
Oh, wow.
Why are you laughing?
A 10 out of 10?
Bro, this is an all-timer for me. This is a great, great film. It's ranked number 24 or 25 on the AFI's Top 100 list.
Wow.
Like, it's not like this movie just snuck in. This is a revered classic movie.
Yeah, I know those facts. I just don't see it. You know, I watched this film and I picked up on a lot of the themes that you were talking about of divorce and hurt and trauma and healing. And those are things that all go straight to my heart that I care very deeply about. But a movie can't just be about its themes. The cinematography has to be good. All of the movie has to be good, and it's just not.
Wow, man. You know, what's really funny is we are in pretty much opposite places as where we were on Star Wars. And I think that this movie is my Star Wars because almost everything that I've said in defense of this movie is what you said in defense of Star Wars. I had a lot of problems with the plot. I had a lot of problems with the lack of a plot in places in Star Wars. And what you argued at that time was like, you don't need it. And I think that's how I feel about E.T. And it's really funny to be sitting on the other side of it now because I'm like, how do you not see what I see in this movie?
See, if you really want to go back into Star Wars, we can get right back into it, and I can tell you how you're wrong about the things you just said. But I think...
I was trying to defend you. What are you talking about?
I think the most important thing is that we need to hear from Film and Whiskey Nation about E.T. I'm genuinely curious, where do you all stand on this movie? You know, where are you coming from? Do you see the trauma and hurt and pain that Bob is talking about? And is that something that makes you want to say, man, this is a 10 out of 10? Or do you kind of see where I'm coming from, where there's a lot of issues with this movie that haven't held up well over the years? And you go, yeah, it's a fine movie, but it's not great.
Or are you splitting the difference? Our average, Brad, is an 8 out of 10. And I think, honestly, most of America probably falls somewhere in that category. You know, an 8 is a really, really good movie. So I'd like to hear what people say. And I'd like to also do a poll where we find out whether I should even continue doing this podcast after Brad gave E.T. a 6 out of 10.
That seems like a very wise thing to do, Bob.
So, Brad, if they want to give us feedback, where can they find us on social media?
On all of the major social media platforms, you will find us at Film Whiskey with an E.
At Film Whiskey with an E, or you can give us a call on our call-in line. We'd love to get your voicemails and play them on the air. Please rake Brad over the coals for any of his ratings on any of our movies. I would love to play those. Our number is 216-800-5923. Once again, that's 216-800-5923.
Next week, we'll be reviewing another truly classic movie, 1994's Forrest Gump.
Oh, Forrest Gump, the Best Picture winner from 1994. Brad, this is going to be our fourth 1994 film this season.
That's absolutely crazy. Let's see, we've done Lion King, Forrest Gump,
Pulp Fiction, and Shawshank.
Pulp Fiction and Shawshank. Man,
what a year.
I was about to say, what a year for movies, man. Much better than 1982.
I'm excited to watch that one. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I am Bob Book.
I am Brad G.
We'll see you next time.
The definition of a cryptid is an animal that has been claimed to exist but never proven to exist. As we binged our favorite Netflix series and slayed our toughest bosses in a video game, we began to wonder about these creatures that appeared and stoked our imagination. What was the inspiration for the Demogorgon, or the Dementor? Well, my name is Dave, and with my co-host Austin, we bring you the Cryptid Cast. Every other Wednesday, we will bring you some information about our favorite modern cryptid. From TV to movies to video games, we explore nerd culture through the lens of extensively suspicious knowledge in cryptozoology. Find us on your favorite podcast service under the name The Cryptid Cast, and follow us on social media at _Cryptid Cast. Come join the growing community of Cryptomania.